Hello, it's Victor again. You know, we've gone into space. We've sent robots to other planets. We've got computers that can create photorealistic moving images, and we can replace human organs with mechanical parts. We're in the future, right? Well, no. Why not? Because we don't have any flying cars. Most of us are holding out for the flying car before we'll admit that humanity has achieved anything in its long time on this planet. It just can't be the future without flying cars. So with that in mind, we're going to look at the gravity-defying vehicles of 3 movies: Blade Runner, Back to the Future Part 2, and Irobot, and then see where we are in developing them in real life.
Now to start with, it should be noted that this was in some ways a difficult one to research. I mean, sure, there are books, movie commentaries, documentaries, and more that analyze all these movies in detail. The trouble is, the characters' vehicles aren't high on their list of priorities, apparently. But this is understandable. See, hovercars are almost never the central theme or subject of a film. They're part of the mise-en-scène, or iconography of science fiction. Which is to say, they're one of the things commonly used to identify a film as being part of science fiction. Westerns have Indians, 6 guns, and horses. Sci-fis have aliens, ray guns, and hovercars. And since hovercars have such a long and varied history, from ferrying George Jetson through the clouds to helping bring Luke Skywalker one step closer to his destiny, we should define our terms. A hovercar, for this review, is a vehicle that is meant to carry 1 to 6 beings, can achieve vertical lift without forward motion, can move across at least 2 dimensions, can safely be piloted within 5 feet of another one, and can't be used to go into space. Everything else is up in the air.
Sorry.
Anyway, on to Blade Runner. The film opens to a shot of a dark, smoggy, densely packed, and immense city. Suddenly, a hovercar flies into view. This, besides being beautiful to look at and very effective at setting the mood, visually establishes the technology level of this future world. It also leads into the first scene with character interaction at the Tyrell Pyramid. From here on in, the hovercars, called flying spinners by the filmmakers, are used mainly for scene transitions. Otherwise, they herald the arrival of our protagonist's superiors. The spinners themselves are said to be aerodynes, using movable jet turbines to achieve lift. This makes them loud and probably energy-consuming. They also coexist alongside normal land cars, and are much fewer in number than their grounded counterparts. This implies that spinners are only accessible to government, businesses, and the wealthy. These aspects of the spinners fit perfectly with the dark, polluted, and socially stratified future portrayed in Blade Runner. How did the filmmakers pull off these effects? Well, keep in mind, until we hit the 90s, computer-generated effects aren't really practical. So the filmmakers mainly used models and layered shots. And you'll notice if you watch this that you see very few hovercars besides the police spinner close up. That's because they only made a few other models besides that of the police vehicle, which they would just repeatedly layer in the background. As for the police spinner, they made several different sized models of it, including one full-size piece that had fully functional lights and moving parts, and a 45-inch long, 65-pound model that, along with having detailed lights and movement, also had detailed puppet occupants. All the detail and attention that was put into the spinners, along with all the other effects, helped to make Blade Runner one of the most memorable and influential science fiction films ever made. This brings us to the Back to the Future series, the first installment of which came out in 1985, 3 years after Blade Runner. But here we're going to focus on Part 2, released in 1989. This is because, with the exception of about 30 seconds at the end of Part 1 and 3, all of the flying vehicles are in Part 2. There are 2 pieces of hover tech that take center stage in this movie. One is the Hover DeLorean, the DeLorean time machine from the first movie given a 2015 hover conversion, and the other is the Hoverboard. More on that later. Meanwhile, the retrofitted DeLorean was a very central tool. Besides just being basic transportation in the 2015 scenes, it also became an advantage in making escapes and hiding during the 1985 and 1965 scenes. Now, the workings of the hovercars themselves are left pretty ambiguous in the films, but studio-sanctioned documentaries suggest they use magnetic energy, which, come to think of it, is still pretty ambiguous. But looking at the film's other hover tech reveals a few interesting ideas. First of all, the hoverboard. Though it can't fly, it can hover a few inches over any surface. It also, over the course of 2 films in a few weeks, never required a change of batteries. Looking back, one notices floating street signs and markers, which, as they're floating over people's homes, probably also don't require frequent battery changes. It's also revealed in the third film that the Mr. Fusion Dr. Brown installed in the DeLorean was used solely to provide the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity needed to power the time machine. The car itself ran on gasoline, and the existence of a 21st century Texaco station implied that in 2015 all hovercars run on gasoline. So hovercars in Back to the Future are low energy, low noise, low pollution, and generally just without downsides. This, along with all the clean and, in many cases, frivolous technology and scenery we see in the future, indicates a world of advancement and convenience. This is in stark contrast with the dark, polluted world of Blade Runner, an effect that was quite intentional on the part of the filmmakers, as Ridley Scott's film was still fresh in the public mind at this point, and they wanted something original. The result is a world that does look like a nice place to live, but which also seems very superficial. As for the effects, they, like Blade Runner, used a lot of models, composite shots, blue screens, and, where needed, cables. The effects weren't quite on par with Blade Runner, but they were still quite good, and completely appropriate for the colorful story being told.
This brings us finally to 2004's Irobot. Now, it's been about 20 years, so the future may not be quite like you remember it.
In this film, we have a detective trying to get to the bottom of a robot conspiracy, traveling from location to location in a hovercar. This hovercar, as with all the others in the film, do not fly. They hover a few inches off the ground, the same distance commonly achieved by, wheels. The primary advantage of Detective Spooner's Hover Audi is the increased maneuverability and speed. The reduced road and tire wear is also a plus.
As for the effects, I'd like to just say they used computers and call it a day, but I guess I should go into more detail.
Trouble is, most of the effects in iRobot went into the robots, somewhat predictably. Most of the hovercars in the film were fully CG or computer-generated. For the hero's car, a physical mock-up was made, which they filmed the actor in, but they admit to replacing most of the mock-up with CG in post-production.
So, yeah, they used computers.
Now, exactly how the cars hover is never addressed in the film or its commentaries, but it appears to be some manner of invisible force. It made a crunching sound when driven on gravel, which assumably means that if you stuck your hand between the hover pad and the ground, you would, at best, feel pressure. This rules out magnetic energy as we understand it, but it could be some other kinetic force. Looking at what these vehicles can tell us about the society, the fact that hovercars are common in this future also indicates that they are relatively cheap to buy and run. This, along with the lack of obvious poverty in the rest of the movie, suggests a somewhat advanced world both technologically and societally. While a social strata definitely exists, it's not noticeably pronounced in this film.